Hey guys, I'm Jim DiCarlo. I'm the current director of the MIT Quest for Intelligence, and today I have the privilege of introducing Marcel Binz, who is an outside invited speaker at our Thursday colloquium. So Marcel did his BS, his bachelor's in cognitive science at Tübingen, Germany. He then also did a master's in machine learning, so you're going to already see the trend of we're going to do cog-sci, we're going to do some computers, so that's in line with the whole Quest and Brains, Minds, Machine philosophy. He later completed his PhD technically in psychology, I guess, and during that period he was actually also spent some of the time visiting in Sam Gershman's lab just down the street at that other university, Harvard. And he then did a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics. And he's recently taken a position at Helmholtz Munich at the Institute for Human-Centered AI. The reason that I am excited to have Marcel here is that he's one of the leaders in this general idea of foundation models of cognition. And as you might, those of you who aren't computer scientists or in machine learning, you might, just to tell you what a foundation model is, it's essentially a computer model that can readily be transferred to a wide range of tasks with very lightweight training, usually a little bit of training and additional parameters to transfer. Often these models are, in the real world, they're trained on very large amounts of data, and then they become useful in all these other general domains. For example, in vision, we like to think of models of the ventral stream as being kind of a foundation model in the sense that our contemporary models of the ventral visual stream, the area that I work in, just like the actual biology, those networks of neurons can support a large number of, for instance, object recognition tasks, a potentially infinite number of tasks. And so for concretely, they could do things like predict what humans will do in terms of successes and failures on held out images for newly trained object recognition tasks, as just an example of how we think of foundation models in vision. But Marcel's been working on a much more general case of foundation models for cognition in general. That's quite ambitious, and hopefully he'll say a bit about this. He introduced a model that they called Centaur, which he may say something about here today. I just want to also say the idea of foundation models of the mind is somewhat controversial. We've been discussing it a lot, but it's clearly a trend in our field, our general field of brains, minds, and machines, and so I think it's a trend that we need to pay attention to. In that sense, I'm very excited to hear what Marcel has to say today. So with that, let's give Marcel a round of applause today.
Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for the kind introductions. Thanks for inviting me. Very excited to be here. As already said, I will talk about this idea of a foundation model of human cognition today. So many of you here in this room are cognitive scientists, and like you, I'm interested in trying to understand the human mind. And what I really find most fascinating about us people is that we are really these amazing generalists, right? We can accomplish so many different things. We make scientific discoveries, we create inspiring art, we go out and explore nature, or we just have fun playing with our friends, right? So it seems like you can place people into almost any environment, you throw a problem at them, and you will get some interesting behavior back. Now, how is that possible? Where do these broad cognitive abilities come from, and how do they fit into one single human mind? So these are the kind of questions that really keep me up at night, and also the kind of questions that drive a lot of my research. So now, before I can talk a bit more about this in detail, let me briefly highlight on a very high level how we typically study the human mind in our field. So more often than not, you're interested in a singular aspect or a singular domain of human cognition. So let's say, for example, you're interested in how people make decisions. Then you design a behavioral experiment, collect human data in this particular domain, figure out how they behave, how they act, what is going on in their mind. And finally, you try to explain the data, and that can be done, for example, using computational models or other kind of tools. And each individual study typically looks at just a singular domain, but across our field, this happens in many different areas of cognition. We study things like deliberation, exploration, causal reasoning, and so on. So the kind of knowledge that we accumulate in such a research paradigm, I would say, is that we have a very solid understanding how human cognition works in this middle layer here on the level of individual experiments that we are running. But there's two things missing in this kind of research paradigm. The first is, how does this knowledge actually generalizes to the broader domains that we are interested in, right? We want to figure out how people make decisions. We're not interested in how do they make decisions in this very specific setting. And furthermore, we pretty much have no idea of how all of the knowledge translates between these upper layers, how it generalizes between different domains. So I think a situation we would much rather be in looks something like this, where we have a unified computational model that can kind of capture all of human cognition jointly within a unified architecture. So I call these foundation models of human cognition in analogy to the foundation models that have become popular in the machine learning community in the recent years. And if we would have access to such a model, that would allow us to make much more robust, much more generalizable claims of the human mind. Now, this idea of having these unified theories in cognitive science is not a new one to the field. For example, Alan Newell has already said as early as 1990 that we really need these unified theories of cognition because they are the only way of how we can bring this wonderful and increasing fund of knowledge that we have under intellectual control. Now, Newell made the statement quite a while ago, 35 years to be precise, so probably before I was born, he put those words onto paper. But we as a field since then didn't really seem to have made much progress towards one of these unified theories of human cognition since he made the statement. Really raising the question, how can we push forward and get and obtain these kind of theories? How is that possible? So, turns out that we have recently seen the emergence of a class of computational systems that can maybe provide some insights into that. Of course, I'm talking about large language models or LLMs. These are huge neural networks trained on vast amount of data taken from the internet to basically predict the next word in a given text sequence. But as we scaled up these models in the recent years, we found that they have many emergent abilities that go far beyond mere next word prediction, that feel to some extent very different qualitatively from just predicting the next word. Modern language models can, for example, translate between languages, they can write computer code for you, or they solve challenging reasoning problems. So these are really the first kind of computational systems that have this very human-like characteristic that you can just pretty much throw any problem at them, and you will get some interesting behavior back. Now, about 3 years ago, I got interested in these kind of systems, and I started to wonder, is it possible to place them in a psychology lab, run psychological experiments on them? That would be interesting for two reasons. First of all, we could use kind of the tools that have been developed in psychology over many decades to kind of shed light into how these black box machines operate, how they make decisions, how they integrate information, and so on. And who knows, maybe we would find out that we have, through a kind of like happy accident, already created one of these foundation models of human cognition that I was talking about earlier. So we summarized our results in a paper called Using Cognitive Psychology to Understand GPT-3. And for this paper, we took back then the most powerful model out there, which was GPT-3 at the time. And we subjected it to a battery of canonical experiments coming from the cognitive psychology literature, covering domains like decision-making, deliberation, exploration, and causal reasoning. So I'll not have the time to go into all of these results in detail today, but I want to still present one example of how the simulations and analysis that we conducted looked like, because that gives a nice intuition of this approach of studying these large black box systems from a psychological perspective. But it will also set the stage nicely for the actual main part of the talk. So one of the first paradigms that we investigated was the so-called two-step task. It's really one of the most widely studied experimental paradigms that you find in all of neuroscience and cognitive science. It's a simple reinforcement learning problem that is designed to detect and disentangle whether people engage in model-based or model-free reinforcement learning. Task works like this. Human participants start in this initial state up here. They have the choice between two actions, the red action and the green action. Each action probabilistically leads to one of two states. The red action most likely leads to the red state, but sometimes stuff goes wrong and you would end up in the green state if you select the red action. And vice versa, the green action predominantly leads to the green state, but sometimes stuff goes on, you end up in the red state. And then once you arrive at one of these two states, the choice between two actions again, that probabilistically lead to some kind of reward feedback based on some drifting reward function. And then this whole process repeats again. You get beamed again, back again to the initial state. You have to make a choice again. And people play typically like 100 to 200 rounds of this little game. So in order to test a language model like GPT-3 on these problems, we had to create a text-based version of it, right? The prompts that we designed for this were essentially created in a way that they contain all kind of information that human subjects get as well when they come into the lab and do the study. So starting first with a brief description of the problem at hand. So here it says you will travel to foreign planets and search for treasures. When you visit a planet, you can choose an alien to trade with. The chance of getting treasures from these aliens changes slowly over time. And now your goal is to maximize the number of treasures that you receive. We then also provide a model with a summary of all previous interactions it's had with this problem. So in this case, this essentially boils down to where have you been at a certain point in time, what did you do, where did you end up, which alien did you trade with, and did you get a reward or no reward. And finally, we'll ask the language model, well, given that you're in a current state, in this cover story here that you're on one of these two planets, in this case, planet X, what do you want to do next? And the language model then solves these kind of problems simply by completing the prompt that is shown here, in this case responding with either alien D or alien F. So we designed text-based experiments for language models in all of the 4 domains that I outlined earlier. And we found really to our surprise back then that language models performed quite well in many of these domains, even outperforming human subjects in some of them. Now, these results are much more expected nowadays, but back then, to me, that was really mind-blowing to see that you could just take about any experiment from the literature, translate it into this kind of weird text-based format, give it to these models, and you would actually get some meaningful behavior back, right? GPT-3 was really the first kind of model that had this kind of really general abilities to do a wide range of cognitive tasks. One notable exception was the causal reasoning experiment that we investigated, and I come back to that in a second. But then we also investigated the behavior of these models more closely, or this model more closely. And we found that it quite strikingly diverged from how people solve these tasks, solves them in very different ways. In particular, we found the biggest divergences in the cases of exploration and causal reasoning. And I think that makes sense if we just remind ourselves of how language models are trained, right? They're just trained to predict the next word in a given text sequence. And they do this in a very passive way, just trying to predict what comes next. But exploration and causal reasoning are 2 types of domains that place a very strong emphasis on actively interacting with your environment. And that mismatch that we are seeing here between what is required by the task at hand and how these models are trained also, I think, explains, at least to some extent, why we see the biggest divergences in these 2 domains. So the key takeaway here is really, yes, language models can solve a lot of these kind of cognitive tasks that we are typically interested in psychology, but they're not the foundation model of human cognition yet out of the box, right? They solve these tasks in very, very different, characteristically very different ways from people. So, but still they're a very interesting concept when thinking about a more unified approach to modeling human cognition, right? Because they're kind of the first systems that have really these very general abilities. So the question that currently drives a lot of my research is, how can we now take these kind of models and turn them into cognitive models, models of human cognition? You might stop me here and say, well, all that is needed to get one of these foundation models of human cognition is to scale them up, make them bigger, train them on more data, and eventually you get a model that is perfectly aligned with human behavior. So I think that's unlikely to be the case, especially if you look at recent work. So here's, for example, one example where the authors show an emergence of economic rationality of GPT. They show that, in particular, the newer models, GPT-4 and so on, become much more rational than the previous generation of models. In fact, they lose a lot of the cognitive biases that we know are present in people, right? So actually scaling up here made these models less aligned to human behavior. Another paper in a similar vein, where the title pretty much says it all, human-like intuitive behavior and reasoning biases have emerged in large language models, but then they disappeared again in newer models, in this case here the authors cite ChatGPT. And these are just 2 examples, there are many other ones, that all kind of paint a similar picture. Just scaling up these models won't lead us to one of these foundation models of human cognition or human behavior. So what can we do instead, right? I think really the key is thinking about the right kind of data. Data is really the fuel that drives these large-scale models, right? And luckily for us in psychology, we have been collecting almost an abundance of data over the last decades. So we thought, well, let's take all of that data, bring it into a unified format. And that led to a data set that we call Psych 101. Psych 101 is a data set for which we took human trial-by-trial data from over 160 experiments, translated them all into a natural language-based format so that it can be readily processed by language models. And this kind of language-based representation is really the glue that allows you to express these vastly different experimental paradigms into a common language. Dataset really reaches an unprecedented scale. It has like records from over 60,000 individuals, and these individuals make over 10 million choices. And it includes pretty much all of the classics that you find in cognitive psychology. Similarity judgment tasks, risk-free choice problems, working memory problems, and so on. You pretty much name it. And that whole effort was really the result of a large-scale international collaboration that involved over 40 people that contributed in various ways from institutions from across Europe and the US. So here's an example, just to illustrate a bit how an individual data point in this data set looked like. Similar to what we had seen before in the two-step task, essentially the idea was we collect all the information that human participants in the lab have as well when they do the study. So starting with a brief description of the problem at hand. In this case, this is a similarity judgment task. So it says you're presented with triplets of objects that will be assigned to different keys. In each trial, you have to indicate which object you think is the odd one out by pressing the corresponding key. And then you see the actual data. In the first trial, participant observed a prune, nail polish, and this cat. In this case, that particular participant thought that this cat is the odd one out object by pressing button Y. And then that continues, includes all the trials that a participant made until the end. These prompts can get quite long depending on the experimental paradigm. Some are up to around 100,000 characters even. And you also see that we mark these specific tokens highlighted here in purple, but also indicated with these specific characters. And these correspond to choices that were made by humans, right? So the actual button presses. And that is useful information because in the end, when we want to align a model to human behavior, we want to get it to produce human choices, right? But we don't want to repeat it, all the other stuff that is part of the experiment. So don't want it to repeat the instructions or all the other things that comes with it. So we then took this data set and fine-tuned a large language model on it in order to align it with human behavior. So more specifically, we started with the large 70 billion parameter version of the open source model Llama 3.1. We applied a fine-tuning technique known as quantized low-rank adaptation. And that led to the first foundation model of human cognition that we call Centaur. So we're really looking in terms of naming for some kind of creature that is half human, half llama, kind of to indicate this merge between both. We looked for a long time. It doesn't exist, I can confidently say now. So eventually we ended up on the nearest neighbor, and that's where the name Centaur came about. I won't talk so much about fine-tuning, but I want to give like a brief high-level overview of what we did and also justify a bit why we chose this particular technique. So the technique that we use is called quantized low-rank adaptation. It's based on the idea that we take a large language model as the basis. This is this pink part in here. We quantize its parameters and we freeze them. So these parameters of the language model are not adjusted during this process of aligning the model to human behavior. Instead, we add these so-called low-rank adapters to each layer of the network. And these contain only a few amount of trainable parameters, around 0.1% of the total model size. And it's only these parameters that are updated through this process of fine-tuning. So and then we wondered, well, how well does Centaur predict human behavior in situations that it has not seen before, right? That is really what we would want out of a foundation model of human cognition. And the first question, perhaps the most obvious one that we ask, can Centaur predict human behavior of new participants that were not part in the training data? So for the plots that I'm showing here, we looked at behavior of these new participants, not seen during training, but they do experiments that were part of the training data, but just done by other participants. So I went ahead and implemented a collection of domain-specific cognitive models for a large set of the behavioral paradigms that are part of Psych 101. This is what you see on the y-axis here. And these kind of models represent the state of the art, have been previously used extensively in the literature to capture human behavior in each of these individual domains, right? So these are like 20, 30 different models that we have implemented here. The plots that I'm showing show how well different models are aligned to human behavior, measured using log likelihoods. So higher values mean that a model is more aligned to human behavior. And this particular plot shows the difference in log likelihoods to these domain-specific cognitive models that I talked about. So this is this gray dotted line in the middle here. So if you're to the right of this line, means the model is more better at predicting human behavior than these domain-specific cognitive models that were handcrafted for each domain. If you're to the left, it's worse. And we found that Centaur, in pretty much all of the domains, was better at predicting human behavior than the domain-specific cognitive models that we looked at. And that is quite exciting, right? It really indicates that we have access here to a model that can predict human behavior really well across all of these different domains, and it does so within a single unified architecture. You can also repeat this analysis with the Llama base model, so the model before any fine-tuning, and that actually works surprisingly well as well. Nevertheless, you see still substantial benefits of fine-tuning in pretty much all of the experiments that we looked at, really indicating that this whole fine-tuning procedure did what it was supposed to do. So in the paper, we then successively tested or probed the out-of-distribution abilities of the model, testing it in increasingly more complicated settings. First question we wondered is it robust to semantic changes in the underlying problem? And to investigate this, we looked at the two-step task that we had already seen before. And the standard cover story that you find for this experiment in the literature is that you are traveling on spaceships to foreign planets in search for treasure. So exactly what we had seen in the example from the beginning. But people have also investigated behavior in slightly different cover stories. This is a popular one that has been proposed a few years ago, where participants are told that they're flying with a magical carpet to different mountains. In this case, this is the pink and the blue mountain, on which they can find genies to trade with. So we thought, well, Centaur was not trained on the magical carpet cover story. It doesn't include any experiments with that particular cover story in its training data, but it includes a lot of experiments that use this classic spaceship cover story. But we found when we looked at how well the model can predict human behavior in this new setting, we found that it did so quite well. These plots here show negative log likelihoods of Centaur, shown in purple, Llama and the domain-specific cognitive models. So here lower is better. And we see that Centaur was generalized fairly robustly to this new setting. We're also interested in, is there some kind of generalization to structural modifications in the underlying problem happening? And in order to test this, we included a lot of two-arm banded problems in Psych 101, the training data behind Centaur. But we purposefully left out any three-arm banded problems because we wanted to see whether the model can generalize to these small modification in the underlying problem. Same plot as before, and we found pretty much the same thing as well. We found that Centaur was really able to robustly generalize under these structural modifications of the problem, much better than domain-specific cognitive model and also than the base Llama model without any fine-tuning. We also tested Centaur on a battery of completely new experiments that were not in the training data in any shape or form, such as the moral machine experiment that I'm showing here. I'm not talking too much about these results, but feel free to check out the paper if you're interested in them. One thing that is not so obvious in the beginning, but I think that is actually quite relevant as well, is we found that Centaur is not able to predict non-human behaviors. How did we test this? Well, we looked at an experiment where human participants come into the lab and they observe two players playing an economic game against each other. So a kind of prisoner's dilemma style game. And then they had to predict the choices of one of these players. And unbeknown to them, that player that they had to predict was either a human subject or an artificial agent with matched behavioral statistics. And what the original result has shown is that people are really good at predicting the behavior of other people, but they can't really predict the behavior of artificial agents with matched behavioral statistics. So we simulated Centaur on exactly the same problem, and we found exactly the same pattern. It was able to predict the choices that were coming from humans, human strategies, quite well, and substantially worse than chance when predicting the choices of an artificial agent. And that is quite interesting, right? Because it really shows that Centaur is picking up on some kind of latent constructs that are important for human cognition. It's not purely engaging in simple statistical learning that can pick up on any kind of regularities in any behavioral sequence. Otherwise, you wouldn't see this trend here. It could also predict behavior of artificial agents in that case. We were also interested, what about neural activity, right? Can we use Centaur to predict activity in the human brain as well? In particular, we wondered, do its internal representations become more aligned with human neural activity? In order to test this, we followed a decoding approach. We took data from the two-step task that we have already seen multiple times, we turned it into our text-based version, and then we extracted internal representations from Centaur based on these given prompts. And then based on these internal representations, we tried to predict human fMRI activity measured in the brain using a simple linear transformation. Plot here shows the result of this analysis, showing correlations between the predicted activity and the actual activity measured using Pearson correlation over different representations extracted from different layers on the x-axis. And we see that Centaur shows an increased alignment also to neural activity relative to the llama model. It's somewhat small but quite significant. And we also see that you really need these large-scale models to even perform these kind of analysis, right? If you would do it with the internal state of a traditional cognitive model, simple reinforcement learning model that is often used to model behavior in this task, you can't really capture the same amount of brain activity. And finally, we also showed that similarly you can use Centaur to or adjust it to predict human response times in addition to the actual choices. Again, I'm not going too much into details here, so feel free to check out the paper on this. So where does that leave us now? So essentially I've talked about Centaur, first foundation model of human cognition. We've seen that Centaur can predict the behavior of held out participants that were not part of the training data. Also that it generalizes to completely unseen experiments, and that it can capture secondary measurements, things like neural activity, but also response times, despite never explicitly trained to predict these kind of quantities, right? It was only ever trained to predict human choices, still can be adapted to these kind of things. Question?
I asked this question a little while ago.
Yeah.
If I understood your results graph correctly, the task on which it was predicting things the poorest was grammaticality judgments. And I was a bit puzzled by that. Isn't that the one thing it should be really good at?
So I think that has nothing to do with like the prediction abilities of Centaur. It's just that the model that we are using in this case as a reference point, the traditional cognitive model, is quite good at capturing these human mistakes in this case, because essentially it's kind of like, it's not even a cognitive model, it's more like a noise ceiling. So I think that's more like the reference point is slightly shifted there. So you could say it's as good as like you can get with noise ceiling, maybe slightly worse, but not too far behind. So essentially where we are right now, we have this very powerful predictive model of human behavior, right? And it's like, in some sense, a massive step up in terms of these traditional cognitive models, in the sense that you can now predict human behavior across a much broader set of situations within a unified architecture. But the real question is, what next? What do we do with this model now? And that's what I want to spend like the last 10 to 15 minutes on, talking about 3 directions that I'm currently interested in. Sometimes I present a bit of preliminary results, but this is all very early work. So first I want to talk a bit about how we are thinking about further expanding the ecosystem behind Centaur, but also behind the data set, Psych 101, that we have collected. Then I want to talk about how we can use these models to make scientific discoveries. And finally, I want to spend some time giving my thoughts on how we can slowly make these models from these black box systems that they currently are into something that is much closer to traditional cognitive architecture, where we're trying to actually capture cognitive processes of the human mind. So let me start by talking about the ecosystem a bit. So I think if you think about machine learning, I think especially in the language model space, something that was really transformative for open source large language models is the Hugging Face interface and its collection of libraries, right? Essentially, this is a platform where people can upload models, data sets, metrics, and all with a unified format so that it can be readily reused in a lot of different contexts. And something like this we currently don't have in cognitive science, cognitive modeling, right? There's no Hugging Face equivalent to something like that. But that is something that I'm definitely, that we recently started to develop. So essentially kind of like a Hugging Brain interface where we have a platform where we have like a space where we can upload data sets in a common format, where you can have models that can deal with this data set and then that can be benchmarked. And we have, from creating Psych 101 as a data set, all this kind of data already, not only in the language-based format, but also in a tabular CSV format with a fairly unified structure. So we're currently cleaning this up a bit more so that this can be eventually used also not only to create these foundation models of human cognition, but also to kind of streamline traditional cognitive modeling a bit more. We are also planning on further expanding this data set. So we recently had kind of in an open research collaboration a call on social media where we said, hey, we want to create this extension of the data set, Psych 201. Here's a GitHub repository. If you have data, contribute your data to this. Eventually, we write like a nice summary paper describing this kind of resource. And that was hugely accepted in the community. In total, in the end, we had like around 100 contributors. And that really let us create a data set that is 4 or 5 times larger than what we had in Psych 201, where we have over 200,000 participants and substantially larger than even the largest mega studies that you find that are currently conducted in psychology. That increase in quantity also reflects in an increased diversity of problems that are included, right? So here in this plot, I created embedding of the different experimental paradigms in both Psych 101 in blue and Psych 201 in orange. And we see with these additional data sets that we collected in this open research collaboration, we're able to cover a much broader space of cognitive science experiments in this kind of data. One defining feature of the data set is that we also collected a lot of meta-information about participants and also transcribed it in a unified format. So that includes things like age from developmental studies, nationality from cross-cultural studies, or questionnaires as they are, for example, collected in clinical studies. And the hope is that we can eventually use this kind of information to create more personalized models of human cognition that can adjust themselves based on this additional information. But that is something maybe for our next talk. We have already done some initial analysis on this new data set. In particular, we used it to evaluate the alignment of different language models with different characteristics, alignment to human behavior in this case, at a really unprecedented scale. So this plot here, or these plots show on the left for the Quen 2.5 family, and on the right for the Llama 3.x family. And what we found is that on the x-axis always plotted over the model size, and on the y-axis plotted the negative log likelihood. So lower here means better aligned to human behavior. And we see that the base models shown in blue are across the board much more aligned to human behavior than instruction-tuned models that went through this additional stages of post-training. And that is not only true for instruction-tuned models, but we have since then repeated this kind of analysis with other kind of models that went through other kind of post-training stages, like vision post-tuning and reasoning. And the same pattern you see as well. Always the models that are most aligned to human behavior are these base models that are just trained to predict the next word in a given text sequence. And that's, I think, quite interesting from a user perspective as well, right? Because as a user, if you go to OpenAI, use ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever, you always interact with models that went through this additional stages of post-training, like instruction tuning. But really, these results indicate that these models are worse aligned to human behavior. But for some applications, you want to have a model that can produce human-like behavior. I think that kind of points to additional ways of how we can improve post-training techniques. We also use this new data set to really evaluate the generalization abilities of Centaur across all of the new experiments. So each point here on the x-axis is, or each bar is one new experiment that is part of Psych 101, Psych 201, but not part of Psych 101. And we plot how much, on the y-axis, how much better is Centaur at predicting human behavior relative to the base llama model before any fine-tuning. And we see there is a benefit of fine-tuning in pretty much all of the experiments that we looked at. A few outliers a bit on the left here. We are currently trying to see if we can identify some kind of common pattern in these, but we haven't found any so far yet. So another interesting question is now, we have these predictive models. How can we use them for scientific discovery, right? How can we use them as tools to learn something about the human mind? We've recently put out a paper in which we proposed an approach for doing exactly that, called automated scientific minimization of regret. It's based on the idea that we take Centaur as a black box predictive model and compare it against a domain-specific cognitive model that is, to some extent, interpretable, makes statements about the underlying cognitive processes. And that comparison is then used to identify data points that are in principle predictable, because Centaur can predict them, but where the traditional cognitive model struggles to make good prediction. How does that work? Basically, we first compute trial-level negative log likelihoods for both of these models, for the cognitive model and also for Centaur. And we then take the difference between them. And if that difference exceeds a certain threshold, we deem this data point as predictable, because Centaur can predict it well, but not predicted yet by the traditional cognitive models. And then we collect all of these data points in a feedback prompt that kind of acts as a summary of, like, here are some situations where you should be able to predict human behavior with your traditional cognitive model, but you can't do it yet. And then that feedback prompt, together with the actual code of the traditional cognitive model, is given to a language-based reasoning model, so DeepSeek R1 or Qwen 3 model. And that model is tasked, based on this information, create an improved cognitive model that fixes kind of the gaps that were identified in this feedback prompt. And that can be an iterative process, right? You can apply this many times until your cognitive model reaches a level of quality that you're happy with. And it's fully autonomous, right? It doesn't require any human in the loop in this whole pipeline. You just press play and wait until the end, until you have discovered cognitive model that is predictive or more predictive than the ones that you started with. So we applied this to human behavior from a multi-attribute decision-making study. In that study, human participants observe or get presented with two objects, in this case these two bicycles. And these objects are characterized by 4 different features. In the experiments here, this was framed as kind of expert ratings, where each expert provided a binary rating of the two products, either approving of the product or disapproving of it. And then based on this information and also the validity of the experts, so this kind of indicates how trustworthy the experts are, human participants has to say which of the two options they would prefer. So we applied ASMR to this kind of experiment, and we found that it quickly discovered cognitive models that were as predictive as Centaur while really maintaining an interpretable character. A plot here, for example, shows AIC values, so lower means the model is better at capturing human behavior, plotted over ASMR iterations, and we see within just 2 or 3 iterations, the model essentially reaches the performance level of Centaur, but still it was the models that resulted from this process were really interpretable. And all of the models, there were multiple ones that reached about the same level of quality, but they all looked very similar in the sense that they allowed to interpolate between different strategies. So here's one example where the model says, well, keep a vector of weights, W, and then you compute a dot product between the set of weights and the actual features to get an estimate of how valuable option A is, and then you repeat the same thing for option B, and you get an estimate for how valuable option B is. And then both of these value estimates get multiplied with a temperature parameter and get passed through a sigmoid function to give you the probability of choosing option A. Now, importantly, there's this additional hyperparameter here, alpha, that allows you to modulate the importance of the expert with the highest validity, so the expert 1 here with 90% validity. And depending on how you set this alpha value, you can interpolate between different kind of strategies, right? if you set alpha to 1, you get a strategy that's known in the literature as a weighted additive strategy, and that has been in the past sometimes phrased as kind of the rational way of solving these kind of problems, if you're willing to make a certain set of assumptions. But as alpha goes to infinity, you continue to increase the importance of the highest validity expert, and in the limit, you essentially get a strategy that only takes the rating of the highest validity expert into account, ignores all the other information, and that is known in literature as a single Q strategy. So in this example here, it's kind of like, I view this a bit of a toy setting, showing that this is a quite interesting approach of automatically discovering interpretable cognitive models of human behavior. But what we are currently trying to do is really scale this up to essentially apply it to all of Psych 101, not only these decision-making studies, but any kind of experiments for which we can build cognitive models in. So last but not least, I want to talk a bit about this idea of turning these highly predictive models of human behavior that we have at the moment into something that is more similar to what you would call traditionally a cognitive architecture. So essentially at the moment, Centaur is a big black box model, right? There's some kind of information, in this case tokens, coming in, they get processed in a model, and at some point the model spits out an action that a human would take in this particular context. But what we are planning to do next is subsequently, iteratively add additional structure to the model, right? Add like different components of memory to it and different ways of how these different memory components can interact. Also want to add different ways of learning, how knowledge, how memory is updated, and also how it's retrieved. And finally, add also different ways of how the model can reason, like different kind of planning strategies, how what is stored in memory can be turned into actions, and make all of these components very explicit and try out different combinations and see kind of what combination do you need. Is that the same in all experiments, or is it really task or even problem specific? So in doing so, we essentially go from these initially black box system to something more closely, to something that is more interpretable. And that is really the goal in the end, that we have, after this process is completed, have a system that has been informed by cognitive science theory and allows us to learn something about the human mind. And I think this approach to building a unified theory of human cognition is quite an interesting one, especially if you put it into the light of previous work that has been conducted. What we have originally done in cognitive science is that we study behavior in all of these individual domains, right? We have all of these individual Lego blocks, and at some point the hope was that we can put them together to get the mind as a whole. But I think that is not likely going to happen based on everything that we have seen. It's just too complicated to figure out how all of these pieces are put together. The approach that I pitched on the last few slides turns this picture around essentially, right? It starts with something very approximate, in this case with a black box model that can predict human behavior well. And now we want to make this model more detailed. We want to add structure to it so that we eventually get something that captures the human mind in its entirety. And I think that is something quite an interesting new approach to these unified theories of human cognition that is now possible with the tools that we have. And with that, I would like to thank my collaborators in my lab for their help in these projects. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm happy to take questions. Should I pass the microphone around? Is that yes, I think. Hmm?
The room will pick up the voices, right?
Ah, okay. Then we can do it like that.
Yeah, thanks for the fascinating talk. Yeah, very, very exciting. I have two parts of the same question regarding the fine-tuning part of Centaur, which kind of what Marcel into Centaur. I guess part one is so some people may argue that the fine-tuning on specific participant data is like not very desirable because like for humans, right, like when sometimes we do like split up correlation, like for humans, you don't need to fine-tune on some other people's data. like the base llama model is already pretty strong. So maybe in the future, when, for example, GPT-6 or some Cloud 5, like maybe you can get by without fine tuning. Actually, maybe you can just by prompting, telling the model to behave like a human, or actually doing some kind of context learning, that putting some human data in context to make predictions. So if that kind of ends up works better than Centaur, then how much of your kind of like proposal is dependent on the fine tuning part versus just language models themselves are kind of foundation models for cognition?
Yeah. Can you briefly remind me of the first question again?
The first is kind of like fine tuning on specific human participants.
Yeah. So I think ideally what we would like to have done is create like separate models for each individual participant, for example, by splitting the data half-half or something like that, right? I think that is a bit impractical for multiple reasons. I think one is kind of, a lot of these experiments is not so obvious how to split your data in half, right? That works, for example, in settings where each problem is independent of each other, but once you have these sequential dependencies, you can't just make a cut and that will kind of destroy the structure in the experiment. And then second is typically how these experiments are conducted. You have like maybe 10 to 100 choices from a participant, so that is way too little to fine-tuning. But I think that there is like an interesting gap here that you want models for an individual participant. The second question was about?
Well, maybe it's kind of like how much is kind of you want fine-tuning to be part of the story versus just as models get more capable, maybe.
Yeah. So I think that depends a bit, right? So if you want just a highly predictive model of human behavior, I think there's no commitment to fine-tuning or whatsoever, right? If it turns out that GPT-6, if you give it a specific prompt, if you do prompt tuning, is better at predicting human behavior, that is useful for many different applications, right? I think where fine-tuning comes back into the picture is this kind of setting here, where you want to train models from scratch that make specific commitments about cognitive processes, right? And there you can't really get around training these models in some way or the other. But yeah, for purely predictive models, could very well be that GPT-6 is better at predicting human behavior. I think at the moment the evidence is small for this, especially like based on the results that have shown that the models become less aligned to human behavior the bigger that they get. And we have also tested some new state-of-the-art models, and they are still worse than Centaur at predicting human behavior in these kind of settings.
Thank you for the talk. I guess I have one question that maybe is really two questions, but you might think that like the thing we would ultimately like to be able to do with the theory of cognition is like predict stuff that matters. You know, it's nice to be able to predict these little experiments people do in the lab and stuff, right? But really you'd like to be able to predict things that end up having utility in the real world in various ways, right? And so,
yeah.
I mean, one thing that I might imagine you might be able to do, and maybe even have tried to do, is to use the model to be able to modify human behavior, like coming up with better nudges, for instance, right?
That was actually one of the first things that we thought about when starting this kind of research.
Okay, so tell me about that. But then the second part of that, of course, is that you would, with a good theory, you would like to be able to fix something when it breaks, right? But in this case, it feels like you're going to need to get way closer to the neurobiology, probably, to do that, but maybe not. So I want to hear your thoughts on both of those.
Yeah. So first about the real-world data, that is something I'm definitely super interested in. And the cool thing about these kind of models is they already are processing language, right? I mean, language now in these kind of framings of these psychological experiments, but conceptually, it wouldn't be different from actual language-based tasks. Like I'm thinking about things, for example, like human conversations that you could adapt these models to, that they can build, that they can serve as model for how people interact. Or they can serve, potentially you could imagine a very similar model being applied to learning in the real world, right? How students react based on teaching material that they present. And I think all the same ideas could be readily applied to that framework here. We're currently exploring some of those, especially in the teaching context, where we kind of then want to have a model that mimics human learning in the classroom, right? And then figure out, can you use these models to create better learning curricula that enable students for success? So that's definitely one thing. The second part was about fixing it when it breaks. Yeah, I think that is the big trouble that you have with these black box models, right? I think and that is where the theory comes in, right? If you have something that is much more structured, you might be more able to do that. I think even in this setting here, you are not like in the same regime as you would be in a traditional cognitive model where you have 5 parameters and a few equations where you can just look at them and then, okay, I have to change this. But I think in this kind of setting where you have more structure, that is more readily possible, hopefully. Yeah.
So one reason why scientists have historically been partial to simple models is because of uniqueness, right, of the model's predictions. And one sort of way in which this class of models that you're talking about is different is that there's typically, secretly, a family of solutions or a family of parameters that will give you the same performance. Of course, in an engineering setting, you don't care if a family of solutions gives you the same performance. But in a scientific setting, I would argue that we're very interested in understanding not just what sort of one thing that the optimizer converged on is like one set of parameters that the optimizer converged on explains the data, but actually what are all the possible and what do they have in common? Is there a path forward to sort of look at it that way?
I think definitely. I mean, in the situations that you're describing, I would say you need additional constraints on how you select between different models, right? And some of these constraints have been explored in the past. So you want a model that is parsimonious, that has a low description length, or similar approaches, I think, could be readily applied there as well.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that, like, just because one, okay, so is there even one Centaur model, or are there like infinitely many Centaur models on a manifold of Centaur models that can all equally achieve the same performance? And what do those Centaur models have in common relative to the ones that the optimizer said don't explain the data? I think that to me is the scientific question. That's why scientists use low-D models, because they can pose questions of that nature, like what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I think definitely an interesting question from the optimization perspective and so on, right? Like what these things have in common. I'm not sure if I see the direct use if you like then want to use these models as theories, but maybe we can talk about this later a bit.
My question was about how you represented the human behavior that these models, the Centaur model was attempting to predict. So human subjects, when they were performing these tasks, they were sort of not experienced in them using pure text tokens.
Yeah.
They had a screen in front of them in most cases, you can imagine. But the Centaur model experiences each individual task as a set of tokens. I was, and maybe to draw sort of a useful contrast, if you look at sort of parallel project of building a foundation model of vision, based on like the convolutional neural network, the model sort of more closely approximates what a human subject experiences, which is an input, which is pixels or whatever. So I was wondering if you had a stance on this choice to sort of have these models compute on text tokens as opposed to something more analogous to
Definitely. I mean, I would have loved to have done this project in Vision, but I think reverse engineering based on the publicly available data, how the actual stimuli that people got looked like, that is like an engineering effort that is far beyond what is like realistic. So I've been thinking about like collecting a large-scale data set from scratch again, where you start specifically with in mind that you want to record the visual data so that you could train a vision foundation model on that data. That seems to me like kind of what you actually want to do, kind of to match the experiences of the model and people. At the moment, kind of there's this hidden assumption that if you would give people these experiments in natural language, like the model sees it, people would behave the same. That is essentially completely untested right now. We expected that reviewers would ask us that in the review process, but it didn't happen. But at some point, we should go back and definitely test it.
Yeah, there's also maybe another interesting answer, which is like, maybe we don't care about matching the experience sort of inputs and we just want to predict.
If you just predict, I think that is totally fine. Yes, agreed.
Thanks so much for the talk. I have a question related to the model size and how they're aligned with human behavior. So in one of the figures that you showed was like 201, you see
So you probably mean this little dip here, right?
Yeah. So, and also the base models, as you increase the parameter size, it gets better. And I was wondering if it is also the same if you use the fine-tuning model with different variation of sizes. Because what I can think is that, so as the model gets bigger, it takes more resources, and it can be harder to kind of update it, even though you're not updating the entire weight. So it could be the case that if it is the case that the base models are more misaligned from the actual human behavior as they scale up, and it gets harder to train.
That you should use smaller models.
Then maybe the larger model isn't even the better large English model to fine-tune it, because the prior is set at a very specific representation that is harder to kind of change based on the more high-quality data that you have recently.
Yeah. So I think there's definitely evidence for something like that happening in like the more settings where people study visual alignment and alignment of language-based representation, where eventually you get this kind of ceiling or it even drops again. So in this case, we have also trained a smaller version of the Centaur model, like an 8 billion parameter version, and that was worse, slightly worse within domain at capturing human behavior, and it broke more easily out of domain. So that seems to go a bit against this trend here yet, but this is, I think, one data point that we have here, right? So, yeah.
There could be the case that these models may not have the best baseline knowledge, but when given with the high quality data, they have one better learning capability in terms of shifting their models about humans.
Yeah, that could be, but in that case, then the smaller model that we have trained as well, like the smaller version of Centaur, would have generalized as well, right? But that it didn't. So I'm not sure if I think there's not proof that this might not be happening, but in at least this one case, it didn't.
Yeah, just a clarification question. So in the automatic scientific minimization of regret, it's not entirely clear to me why you need Centaur at all. Like you could have the same pipeline and then ask O1 or like whatever training model you want to explain the trials that have the cognitive model explained in the worst possible way.
So I guess here in this case, you need some kind of noise ceiling, right, to figure out which data points are predictable and which ones are not, right? And for many of the tasks, such a noise ceiling is not readily available, right? Because you have all of these sequential dependencies, right? So here kind of Centaur acts as this kind of noise ceiling. How good can you predict human behavior in principle? And there was previous work showing that if you have this additional noise ceiling and not compare it on the actual raw performance, that helps when doing this kind of scientific regret minimization approach. In this preprint here, we have not fully benchmarked this. So that should be something that is definitely needs to be done when we scale this up to many different problems.
Marcel, thank you. That was cool. I have a question about what you were just referring to, noise ceilings. And it kind of came up with, I think, Josh's question about grammar.
Mm-hmm.
Your plots are basically, the plot you showed at the beginning about how Centaur was doing, or the two, and how Llama were doing,
Mm-hmm.
and the one you just showed there, they're this log likelihood relative to some cognitive model.
Yeah.
So that's like 1, which is 0 on the log scale. And then, but the noise ceilings are not visible on as plots, if I understand.
Because you don't have noise ceilings for pretty much all of these experiments. Well, but there's no repeated measurements, right? Because there's like people do these sequential tasks and each individual observes a different trajectory, right? So you cannot pool across participants in any.
Important. Like, I guess I was going to ask you how far are these from the noise ceilings, but you don't even know.
We don't know that. Like like I think in many of these tasks you cannot just know it. It's not that readily computable. In some of these you can actually. So we have like plots in the appendix where we compute a noise ceiling for some of these tasks. Like, for example, I think what we have is risky choice and intertemporal choice, where we compute these noise ceiling and look how close Centaur is to them. Actually, what we find there is that Centaur actually exceeds the noise ceiling because the noise ceiling is independent of these temporal sequential dependencies that you have in the data, but human behavior has these kind of sequential dependencies, and Centaur can pick up on them. So it's actually better than that kind of hypothetical noise ceiling. So it's a tricky thing. Ideally, you would like to know, but I don't think in general you can know it for these kind of tasks.
Okay, we should probably say thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for the questions.